The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet street as Detective Raymond Cole cruised through the neighborhood in his patrol car. He'd been on the force for nearly 13 years, and in that time he'd developed what he liked to call a sixth sense about people. His partner had called in sick that day, so Raymond was riding solo, which was exactly how he preferred it. No one to question his decisions or second-guess his instincts. That's when he spotted it. A sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows moving through the upscale neighborhood at a perfectly legal speed. Something about it just didn't sit right with Raymond. Maybe it was the expensive car, or maybe it was the tinted windows, but his instincts told him this was worth checking out. He flipped on his lights and hit the siren. The Mercedes pulled over immediately, no hesitation, no attempt to flee. The driver rolled down the window before Raymond even got out of his car. But that didn't matter to Raymond. He'd already made up his mind about what kind of stop this was going to be. Raymond approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his service weapon. Through the now open window he could see the driver clearly. A well-dressed black man in what looked like an expensive suit, probably in his mid-40s, hands already visible on the steering wheel. The man's calm demeanor should have put Raymond at ease, but instead it seemed to irritate him. "License and registration," Raymond barked, his tone sharp and aggressive. "And keep your hands where I can see them." "Of course, officer," the driver responded, his voice steady and polite. "My wallet is in my jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, nice and slow." The driver moved deliberately, retrieving his wallet and documents without any sudden movements. He handed them over through the window. Raymond barely glanced at them before shoving them in his pocket. "Step out of the vehicle," Raymond ordered. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" the driver asked, still maintaining that infuriatingly calm tone. "Your taillight is out," Raymond lied smoothly. He'd been doing this long enough to know how to create probable cause when he needed it. "Now step out of the car. I'm not going to ask again." The driver complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. As he stood beside the Mercedes, Raymond could see the quality of his suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, the polished leather shoes. It all rubbed Raymond the wrong way. In his mind, something didn't add up. "This your car?" Raymond asked, circling the vehicle like a predator sizing up prey. "Yes, it is." "You got proof of that? Registration, say your name?" "The registration is in the documents I handed you," the driver said patiently. Raymond didn't like the way this man spoke. Too educated, too composed, too confident. In Raymond's experience, people who had nothing to hide usually acted nervous around cops. This guy's calmness felt like disrespect. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle," Raymond announced, already moving toward the car door. "Am I being detained?" the driver asked. "And if so, on what grounds?" There it was. That question. Raymond hated when people knew their rights. It made his job harder, made him look bad. He turned back to face the driver, taking a step closer, using his physical presence to intimidate. "You trying to tell me how to do my job?" Raymond's voice dropped lower, more threatening. "I smell marijuana coming from your vehicle. That's probable cause. Now you can either cooperate or we can do this the hard way." "Officer, I don't use marijuana. You won't find any in my vehicle. I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to know the legal basis for this search." Raymond felt his face getting hot. This guy was really pushing his buttons. Who did he think he was, talking about legal basis? Raymond had pulled over dozens of people in this neighborhood over the years, and most of them just shut up and took it. But this one wanted to play lawyer. "Where'd you get a car like this?" Raymond asked, changing tactics. "What do you do for a living?" "I don't see how that's relevant to a traffic stop." "Answer the question." "I work for the city," the driver said simply. Raymond snorted. "City job, huh? What, you work in sanitation or something?" The condescension dripped from his words. "Because I'm having a hard time believing you bought this car on a city salary." "I've committed no crime, officer. If you're not charging me with anything, I'd like to leave." That was it. Raymond had had enough. He pulled out his radio and called for backup. "This is Cole. I need another unit at my location. Got a suspicious individual, possibly drugs in the vehicle, driver being uncooperative." The driver's eyebrows went up slightly at the word uncooperative, but he said nothing. He just stood there, hands at his sides, waiting. That calm was driving Raymond crazy. Within minutes, another patrol car pulled up. Officer Lisa Chen stepped out, a 5-year veteran who Raymond had worked with a few times before. She was young, still idealistic, and Raymond had always thought she was too soft for police work. "What have we got?" Lisa asked as she approached. Broken taillight, smell of marijuana. Driver being difficult, Raymond rattled off. Lisa walked around the Mercedes slowly, and Raymond saw her pause at the rear of the vehicle. She crouched down, examining the taillights closely. When she stood up, there was confusion on her face. "Raymond, the taillights are working fine," she said quietly. "I know what I saw," Raymond snapped.
"And I smell marijuana." Lisa took a subtle sniff of the air.
Raymond could see the doubt in her eyes, but she wasn't going to contradict him in front of a civilian. That was the code. Officers backed each other up, even when they knew something was off. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Lisa asked the driver, her tone considerably more respectful than Raymond's had been. "My name is Commander Vincent Hayes," the man said calmly. "I'm the head of internal affairs for this police department." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Raymond felt his stomach drop. His face, which had been red with anger moments before, now drained of color. Lisa's eyes went wide with recognition. She'd been at the department meeting just 3 months ago when Commander Hayes had been introduced to the force. Raymond's mind raced, trying to calculate how bad this was. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. All those things he'd said, all those accusations, the lies about the taillight and the marijuana, they'd all been captured on his body camera, the camera that was required to be running during every traffic stop, the camera that uploaded directly to the department servers. "I'm going to need both of your badge numbers," Commander Hayes said, pulling out his phone. His voice was still calm, but now there was an edge of authority to it that hadn't been there before. "And I'll be reviewing all body camera footage from this stop." Raymond wanted to say something, wanted to explain, wanted to somehow take back the last 15 minutes. But what could he say? Every word out of his mouth had been recorded. Every gesture, every assumption, every prejudiced comment. It was all there. Digital evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Lisa spoke up, her voice professional but strained. "Commander Hayes, I apologize for any misunderstanding. I'm Officer Lisa Chen, badge number 2847. Raymond finally found his voice, though it came out weak and shaky. "Detective Raymond Cole, badge 1523. Commander Hayes typed the numbers into his phone without looking up. When he did finally meet Raymond's eyes, there was no anger there, no satisfaction. Just a deep weariness, as if this was something he'd experienced too many times before. "You're both free to go," Hayes said. "I'll be in touch." He got back into his Mercedes and drove away, leaving Raymond standing on the sidewalk feeling like his entire world had just collapsed. Lisa looked at him, and Raymond could see the mixture of pity and disappointment on her face. "What were you thinking?" she asked quietly, but Raymond had no answer. He'd been so certain, so confident in his instincts. He'd never stopped to question whether those instincts were based on facts or something far uglier. And now there was no taking it back. The cameras had seen everything, and the one person who had the power to end his career had been on the receiving end of it all. As Raymond drove back to the station, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, he knew that everything was about to change. Not just for him, but for everyone who'd been doing things the way he had. The reckoning was coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. Commander Vincent Hayes sat in his office the next morning, a cup of coffee growing cold on his desk. He'd barely slept. Not because he was angry, though he certainly had every right to be. No, what kept him up was the familiar weight of disappointment. 3 months into his new position, and he'd already experienced firsthand what so many people had been trying to tell him about this department. His assistant, Lieutenant David Park, knocked on the doorframe before entering. David had been with Internal Affairs for 6 years and had seen more than his share of officer misconduct cases. He carried a thick manila folder that he placed on Vincent's desk with a heavy thud. "That's Detective Raymond Cole's personnel file," David said, settling into the chair across from Vincent. "You're going to want to read this sitting down." Vincent opened the folder and started reading. The first few pages were standard stuff, commendations, regular performance reviews, nothing unusual. But then he reached the complaints section and his jaw tightened. 17 formal complaints over the past 6 years. 17. And that was just the ones that had been officially filed. "Walk me through this," Vincent said, looking up at David. 14 of those 17 complaints involve people of color, David explained, his finger tracing down the list. Traffic stops mostly, but a few domestic calls, couple of street encounters. Every single one was marked as unfounded or insufficient evidence by the previous director. Vincent flipped through the pages, reading the details of each complaint. A college kid pulled over for supposedly running a red light that multiple witnesses said was green. A middle-aged woman accused of shoplifting with no evidence. A teenager stopped for matching a description that was so vague it could have applied to half the city. The pattern was clear as daylight. Who was the previous director? Vincent asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Captain Gerald Thompson. He retired about 2 weeks before you came on board. 30 years with the department, last 12 heading internal affairs. David paused, choosing his words carefully. He was pretty tight with some of the senior officers, very much part of the old guard. Vincent sat back in his chair processing this information. It wasn't just about Raymond Cole anymore. This was systemic. Complaints had been buried, patterns had been ignored, and officers who should have been disciplined or retrained were still on the streets, still pulling over innocent people, still making the department look bad. Meanwhile, across town at the precinct, Raymond was trying to hold it together. He'd come in early, hoping to avoid the morning briefing crowd, but word had already spread. Officers who'd been his friends for years were now keeping their distance. Some gave him sympathetic looks. Others seemed angry, as if he'd betrayed them by getting caught. In the locker room, Raymond ran into his old partner, Detective Frank Morrison. Frank had been on the force for 20 years and had taught Raymond most of what he knew about being a cop. "You hear what happened?" Raymond asked, trying to sound casual. "Whole department heard," Frank replied, not making eye contact as he adjusted his uniform. "What were you thinking, Ray?" "I was just doing my job, man." "How was I supposed to know who he was?" Frank finally looked at him, and there was something hard in his eyes. "That's the problem, isn't it? You shouldn't have been doing what you did to anyone. Doesn't matter who they are." The words stung because they came from Frank. Raymond had always thought they saw things the same way, that they understood how the streets really worked. But now Frank was looking at him like he was a stranger. Back in Vincent's office, the commander had made a decision. He called Chief Patricia Mendez, the department head who'd specifically recruited him for this job. Chief Mendez had been trying to reform the department for years, but she'd faced resistance at every turn. That's why she'd brought in Vincent, someone from outside the old boys club. "Chief, I need you to authorize a full investigation," Vincent said when she answered. "Not just into Detective Cole, but into how these complaints have been handled historically." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we need external oversight. I'm talking State Attorney General's office bad." Chief Mendez sighed. "You know this is going to blow up, right? The union's going to fight us, half the department's going to close ranks, and the media's going to have a field day." "I know," Vincent said, "but if we don't do this right, if we just sweep it under the rug like it's been swept before, nothing changes. And the next time someone gets pulled over for driving while black, it might not end with just hurt feelings and violated rights. Someone could get killed." "Do what you need to do," the chief said. "You have my full support." Vincent assembled a small team of investigators he knew he could trust. David Park was the obvious choice. He also brought in Officer Lisa Chen, the woman who'd been at the traffic stop. When he called her into his office, she looked terrified, probably thinking she was in trouble too. "Sit down, Officer Chen," Vincent said gently. "You're not here because you did anything wrong. I actually want you on my investigation team." Lisa's surprise was evident. "Sir, I'm just a patrol officer." "I don't have investigative experience, but you have something more important. You have integrity. I watched the footage from that stop. You questioned the probable cause, you checked the taillights yourself, and you treated me with respect, even when your fellow officer didn't. That tells me what kind of cop you are." Lisa nodded slowly. "What would you need me to do?" "I need someone who still works in the field, someone the other officers will talk to. There's a culture of silence in this department, and I need to break through it. Officers are more likely to open up to you than to someone sitting in an internal affairs office." Over the next few days, the team began their work. They pulled files, reviewed footage, and tracked down people who'd filed complaints that had gone nowhere. Each case they examined revealed more problems. It wasn't just Raymond. There were other officers with similar patterns, and they'd all been protected by the same system. One case particularly caught Vincent's attention. 3 years ago, a young man named Tyler Brooks had filed a complaint against Raymond for excessive force during a traffic stop. Tyler had been pulled over for a supposed lane violation. When he'd asked questions about why he was being stopped, Raymond had yanked him out of the car and thrown him against the hood, giving him a black eye and a split lip. Tyler had documented everything. He'd taken photos of his injuries, gotten statements from witnesses, and filed a detailed complaint. And it had all been dismissed as exaggerated and inconsistent with officer testimony. The investigating officer at the time, Captain Gerald Thompson, the retired Internal Affairs Director. Vincent tracked down Tyler's contact information. He was now in law school, studying to become a civil rights attorney. When Vincent called him, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I filed that complaint 3 years ago," Tyler finally said. "Nobody cared then. Why should I believe anything's different now?" "Because I'm not the person who handled it before," Vincent said simply. "And because this time things are going to be different. But I need your help. Would you be willing to talk to me about what happened?" Tyler agreed to meet, though Vincent could hear the skepticism in his voice. When they sat down together 2 days later, Tyler's hand shook as he recalled the incident. The fear and humiliation were still fresh even after 3 years. "I was terrified," Tyler admitted. "I kept thinking, this is how it happens. This is how innocent people end up dead during traffic stops. I did everything right. I was polite, I kept my hands visible, I didn't argue, and he still hurt me. And then when I tried to report it, I got treated like I was the criminal." Vincent listened, taking notes, letting Tyler tell his story without interruption. When he was done, Vincent asked the question he'd been dreading. "Would you be willing to testify if this goes to a formal hearing?" Tyler looked down at his hands, considering. "If I do this, will it actually matter? Or is this just going to get buried like before?" "I can't promise you it'll be easy," Vincent said honestly. "But I can promise you that I'll fight for the truth to come out." "You deserve that. Everyone who's been treated this way deserves that." "Then yes," Tyler said. "I'll testify." Back at the precinct, Raymond was starting to panic. He'd heard through the grapevine that Internal Affairs was digging into his old cases. His union representative had told him to keep his mouth shut and not talk to anyone. But Raymond was feeling cornered. He made a mistake that afternoon, one that would come back to haunt him. He saw Vincent in the parking garage after shift change. Vincent was walking to his car, checking something on his phone. Raymond approached him, trying to seem casual but failing miserably. "Commander Hayes," Raymond called out. "Can we talk?" Vincent stopped and turned, his expression neutral. "I don't think that's appropriate, Detective Cole. You're under investigation." "Look, I just want to explain," Raymond said, taking a step closer. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit in an office all day, but I'm on the streets. I have to make split-second decisions. Sometimes I get it wrong, but I'm just trying to keep people safe." "By lying about broken taillights?" Vincent asked calmly. "By making up probable cause?" Raymond's frustration boiled over. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Coming in here with your fancy title, trying to make examples out of good cops. You don't know how things work here. You're making enemies, Commander, people who've been here a lot longer than you." Vincent didn't react to the veiled threat. Instead, he simply pointed up at the corner of the garage. "You see that camera, Detective? The one that's recording this entire conversation? I had all the security cameras in this facility upgraded last month. High-definition, crystal-clear audio." Raymond's face went pale as he realized what he'd just done. He'd essentially threatened a superior officer on camera. He stammered something that might have been an apology and hurried away. That evening, Vincent sat in his home office, his wife bringing him dinner since he'd missed family mealtime again. Dr. Angela Hayes, a psychology professor at the local university, set the plate down and studied her husband's face. "You look exhausted," she said softly. "This is bigger than I thought," Vincent admitted. "It's not just one bad cop. It's the whole system that protected him and others like him, and now I have to figure out how to fix something that's been broken for years." "You know what you're doing is important, right?" Angela said, sitting beside him. "Not just for you, but for every person who's ever been pulled over for driving while black. For every kid who's learned to fear police instead of trust them." Vincent nodded. He knew she was right. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about making the department he worked for actually serve and protect everyone, not just some people. The investigation was only beginning, but already Vincent could see the scope of what they were facing. Years of buried complaints, a culture of silence and intimidation, officers who thought they were above the law. It was going to take more than a few interviews and disciplinary hearings to fix this. But Vincent was determined. He'd been given this position for a reason, and he wasn't going to waste it. Justice moved slowly in law enforcement, but it did move. And this time, finally, it was moving in the right direction. 3 weeks into the investigation, Commander Vincent Hayes realized they'd uncovered something far worse than one problematic officer. His team had reviewed over 200 complaints from the past decade, and the patterns were impossible to ignore. Every thread they pulled revealed another knot in a tangled web of misconduct and cover-ups. Lieutenant David Park spread out a series of charts on the conference room table. He'd been working 18-hour days, cross-referencing complaints, body camera footage, and witness statements. What he'd found was stunning in its clarity. "Look at this," David said, pointing to a color-coded map of the city. "These red dots represent traffic stops that resulted in complaints. Notice anything?" Vincent studied the map. The red dots clustered heavily in 3 neighborhoods, all predominantly Black and Latino communities. Meanwhile, the wealthy suburbs on the north side of the city had almost none. "Now look at this," David continued, pulling up another chart. "These are the officers with the most complaints. Detective Cole is number 3 on the list, but look at numbers 1 and 2. Vincent's eyes widened. Officer Brandon Phillips had 23 complaints over 8 years. Sergeant Tom Rivera had 19. Both were still on active duty. Both had been investigated multiple times by the previous Internal Affairs Director. Both had been cleared every single time. How is this possible? Vincent asked, though he already knew the answer. Captain Thompson protected them, David said flatly. I found emails between Thompson and these officers. They were friends, went fishing together, their kids played on the same baseball team. When complaints came in, Thompson would either dismiss them outright or conduct investigations so poorly that they'd never stick. Officer Lisa Chen had been doing her own digging among the rank and file. Officers trusted her in ways they'd never trust someone from internal affairs. Over coffee and during shift changes, she'd been listening to their stories. What she heard disturbed her deeply. There's a code, Lisa reported back to the team. Officers call it having each other's backs. If you see another cop doing something wrong and you report it, you become a pariah. Your backup might arrive a little slower when you call for help. Equipment requests get lost. You get assigned to the worst shifts in the worst neighborhoods. That's not having someone's back, Vincent said quietly. That's being an accomplice, Lisa nodded. I talked to a veteran officer who's retiring next month. He was willing to speak honestly because he's got nothing to lose anymore. He told me he witnessed Detective Cole and Officer Phillips conduct at least a dozen questionable stops over the years. He never reported any of them because he saw what happened to officers who did. What happened? David asked. One officer, Jessica Torres, she reported another cop for planting evidence during a drug bust. The union came after her, accused her of being disloyal. She got transferred 3 times in 2 years, always to the most dangerous assignments. Eventually, she quit and moved to another state. Vincent felt a familiar anger building in his chest. This wasn't just a few bad apples. This was an orchard that had been cultivated to produce exactly this kind of fruit. The system had been designed to protect officers who violated people's rights, and to punish those who tried to stop it. The investigation took another turn when they started examining how complaints were processed. Vincent discovered that under Captain Thompson's leadership, complainants were often discouraged from following through. Some were told their complaints were frivolous. Others were intimidated by having multiple officers show up at their homes for follow-up interviews. One woman, Rachel Kim, had tried to file a complaint after Officer Phillips pulled her over and made inappropriate comments about her appearance. When she went to the station to file the complaint, she was made to wait for 3 hours. When someone finally saw her, they told her it would be her word against a decorated officer's, and that filing a false complaint against an officer was itself a crime. Rachel left without filing anything. Vincent called Rachel personally. She was hesitant at first, worried about retaliation, but when Vincent explained that multiple women had similar experiences with the same officer, she agreed to come in and give a formal statement. I felt so powerless, Rachel told them during her interview. Here I was, a victim, and they made me feel like the criminal. I'm a teacher. I have no record, not even a parking ticket. But he treated me like I was trying to ruin this officer's life for fun. The team also uncovered something that made Vincent's blood run cold. There were at least 15 complaints that had been filed, and then mysteriously disappeared from the system entirely. No record of investigation, no disposition, nothing, just gone. David found them only because he'd gotten access to an old backup server that Captain Thompson apparently didn't know existed. One of those disappeared complaints was from Tyler Brooks, the law student who'd been assaulted by Detective Cole. Tyler had actually filed 2 complaints. The first one, the detailed one with photos and witness statements, had vanished. Only his second, abbreviated complaint, filed weeks later after he'd been told the first one was lost, remained in the official records. Vincent brought this to Chief Mendez, and she made the decision he'd been hoping for. She authorized bringing in investigators from the State Attorney General's office. This was no longer just an internal matter. This was a civil rights investigation. While the investigation expanded, Detective Raymond Cole was spiraling. He'd been placed on desk duty, stripped of his weapon and badge. Every day he sat in a small office, filing paperwork and watching the clock. The other officers mostly avoided him now. He'd become toxic, a reminder that the old ways weren't working anymore. Raymond's supervisor, Sergeant Tom Rivera, was facing his own problems. The investigation had revealed that he'd witnessed numerous problematic stops and done nothing. In some cases, he'd even participated, joking with Raymond and others about the people they'd pulled over. Body camera footage showed him laughing when Raymond made a racist comment during a traffic stop. When Vincent called Rivera in for an interview, the sergeant came in cocky, convinced he could talk his way out of trouble. That confidence lasted about 5 minutes. "You were Detective Cole's supervisor," Vincent began. "You rode with him. You reviewed his reports. You signed off on his stops. Are you telling me you never noticed a pattern in his behavior?" "Officers have different styles," Rivera said with a shrug. "Raymond's may be a little rough around the edges, but he gets results." "Results?" Vincent pulled up a video on his laptop and turned it toward Rivera. "Is this what you call results?" The video showed Raymond pulling over a teenage kid on a bicycle, claiming the kid had run a stop sign. The kid, who couldn't have been more than 16, was terrified. Raymond forced him to empty his pockets, searched his backpack, and questioned him aggressively about gang affiliations. The kid had no record, was an honor student, and had been on his way home from the library. Raymond found nothing because there was nothing to find. But he kept the kid there for 45 minutes, humiliating him in front of his neighbors. "You were there," Vincent said, pointing to the figure in the background of the video. "You watched this happen. You even told him good job afterward." Rivera's cocky expression had faded. "Look, maybe it wasn't our best work, but the kid fit a description." "What description?" "Of what crime? There was no robbery, no assault, nothing in that area that day." "You know how I know?" "Because I checked." Vincent leaned forward. "You targeted that kid because of how he looked and where he lived. And you did it over and over again to dozens of people." "I want my union rep," Rivera said, his voice finally showing some fear. "That's your right," Vincent agreed. "But understand something, Sergeant. Your union rep can't make this video disappear, can't make the pattern disappear, can't make 17 complaints disappear. The only question now is whether you're going to take responsibility or keep pretending you were just following orders." The investigation was starting to attract media attention. A local reporter, Karen Mitchell, had gotten wind of the story through a source in the department. She started digging, interviewing people who'd filed complaints. Soon, the local news was running stories about systemic racism in the Metro Police Department. Tyler Brooks agreed to do an on-camera interview. He was articulate, sympathetic, and his story was compelling. He described his assault by Detective Cole and the dismissal of his complaint. The interview went viral online, shared thousands of times. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the police department. Vincent watched the coverage from his office, feeling the weight of public attention. This was good in some ways. It meant they couldn't sweep it under the rug. But it also meant every move they made would be scrutinized. Any misstep would become a headline. Chief Mendez called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. Some of the older commanders were pushing back, saying the investigation was damaging department morale and making it harder for officers to do their jobs. One captain even suggested they were overreacting to a few isolated incidents. Isolated? Vincent couldn't stay quiet. He pulled out his tablet and started scrolling through data. "We have over 200 complaints that show clear patterns of racial bias. We have video evidence of officers lying about probable cause. We have documented cases of complaint suppression and witness intimidation. At what point does this stop being isolated and start being systemic?" The room fell silent. Chief Mendez looked around at her commanders. "Commander Hayes is right. This isn't about a few bad officers. This is about a culture that's been allowed to fester for too long. And if we don't address it now, if we don't take real action, then we're just as guilty as the ones who did it. That night, Vincent got a threatening phone call at home. The voice was disguised, but the message was clear. You need to back off. You're going after good cops who are just trying to do their jobs. Keep pushing, and you might find yourself having an accident. Vincent reported the call immediately, but it shook him. Angela saw the worry on his face and sat down beside him on the couch. Maybe you should step back, she said softly. Let someone else take lead on this. I can't, Vincent replied. If I back down now, if I let them intimidate me, then nothing changes. And the next person in my position might not be willing to push as hard. I'm scared for you, Angela admitted. For us, what if they come after our family? Then we make sure we're protected. I'll talk to the chief about security. But Angela, I can't stop. Too many people have been hurt by this system. Tyler, Rachel, that teenage kid on the bike, they deserve justice. The next morning, Vincent found his car had been vandalized. Someone had slashed all 4 tires and spray-painted a crude message on the hood. The security cameras in his neighborhood had conveniently malfunctioned during the time it happened. Chief Mendez assigned him a protection detail and had his car repaired at department expense. She also made an announcement to the entire force that any retaliation against the investigators would result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges. But the damage was done. Vincent now knew for certain that there were people in the department who would rather intimidate and threaten than face accountability. It made him more determined than ever to see this through. The State Attorney General's office completed their preliminary review and announced they were opening a formal civil rights investigation into the department. They'd be looking at patterns and practices, use of force policies, and how complaints were handled. It was the kind of federal oversight that could result in a consent decree, fundamentally changing how the department operated. Raymond Cole, watching all this unfold from his desk duty assignment, realized his career was over. But more than that, he was starting to understand he might be facing criminal charges. Civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, intimidation of witnesses. The charges could add up to serious prison time. For the first time since that traffic stop, Raymond allowed himself to think about what he'd actually done. All those people he'd pulled over, all those lives he'd disrupted. He justified it to himself as good police work, as keeping the streets safe. But sitting there, alone in that small office, he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. He'd become exactly the kind of cop he'd sworn never to be. And now finally, he was going to face the consequences. The story broke wide open on a Tuesday morning when reporter Karen Mitchell published a comprehensive investigation in the city's largest newspaper. She'd spent weeks gathering evidence, interviewing victims, and analyzing the data that Vincent's team had uncovered. The headline read, "Decades of Discrimination: How One Police Department Protected Officers Who Violated Civil Rights." The article was devastating. It included interviews with Tyler Brooks, Rachel Kim, and a dozen other victims whose complaints had been buried. It showed the statistical patterns, the clusters of stops in minority neighborhoods, the disproportionate use of force. Most damning of all, it included quotes from leaked emails between former Captain Gerald Thompson and several officers, including Detective Raymond Cole, where they joked about the complaints against them. Within hours, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By evening, protesters had gathered outside police headquarters, demanding accountability. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising a full investigation and reform. Chief Mendez stood beside him, looking tired but determined. Vincent watched the press conference from his office. His phone hadn't stopped ringing all day. Civil rights organizations were calling to offer support. Officers were calling to complain he'd betrayed the department. Victims were calling to tell their stories, emboldened by the public attention. The police union held their own press conference that afternoon. The union president, a veteran officer named Gary Wilson, tried to frame the investigation as an attack on all police officers. "Our brave men and women put their lives on the line every day," he said. "And now they're being vilified because of the actions of a few individuals." But the reporters weren't buying it. One asked about the 200 complaints and why the union had defended officers with clear patterns of misconduct. Another brought up the emails. Gary stumbled through his answers, and by the end of the press conference it was clear the union's position was untenable. Behind closed doors, The union was having a different conversation. Gary met with his board of directors to discuss Detective Raymond Cole's case. They'd initially planned to defend him vigorously, as they did with all members. But the evidence was overwhelming and public sentiment had turned decisively against them. "If we fight this, we're going to lose," one board member argued, "and we're going to take the whole union down with us." Cole made his choices and they were recorded on camera. "We can't defend what's on those videos," Gary reluctantly agreed. He called Raymond that evening to deliver the news. "The union's not going to represent you in fighting the termination," he said. "We'll help with the criminal defense to an extent, but Ray, you're on your own for the employment side." Raymond had been expecting it, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. The union had always been there, always had his back, or so he thought. Now, when he needed them most, they were walking away. The state attorney general's office moved quickly once they saw the public attention. They announced criminal charges against Raymond Cole, including deprivation of rights under color of law, falsifying police reports, and intimidation of witnesses. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison. They also charged Officer Brandon Phillips with similar offenses, and they offered Sergeant Tom Rivera a deal. If he testified truthfully about the culture of the department and his own role in covering up misconduct, they'd give him immunity from prosecution, but he'd have to resign from the force. Rivera took the deal. He had a family to think about, a mortgage to pay, and honestly, after weeks of reflection, he'd come to realize that he didn't want to be a cop anymore. Not the kind of cop he'd become anyway. His testimony before a civilian oversight board was shocking. He described how Captain Thompson had actively discouraged officers from filing complaints about their colleagues. How there was an informal ranking system among officers, where those who made the most stops and arrests were celebrated, regardless of how they got those numbers. How he and others had learned to word their reports carefully to create justification for stops that had no legitimate basis. "We called it testily-ing," Rivera admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "Making up facts to justify what we'd already done. It was so common that we didn't even think about it anymore. It was just part of the job." The courtroom audience gasped. Vincent, sitting in the back row, felt validated but also deeply sad. This was exactly what he'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed so bluntly was still jarring. Raymond's trial began 6 weeks after the charges were filed. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They showed body camera footage from multiple stops, including the one with Commander Hayes. They brought in victims who testified about their experiences. Tyler Brooks took the stand and described his assault, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Raymond's defense attorney tried to argue that he'd been following department training and protocols, but the prosecution quickly dismantled that argument. They brought in police training experts who testified that nothing Raymond did was consistent with proper procedure. They showed that he'd been trained on constitutional rights, on proper traffic stop procedures, on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. The most powerful testimony came from Officer Lisa Chen. She'd been at the stop with Commander Hayes, and she'd seen everything. She testified about how Raymond had lied about the broken taillight, how he'd made up probable cause, how he'd been aggressive without justification. "I've been a police officer for 5 years, Lisa said from the witness stand. "I've done hundreds of traffic stops. What Detective Cole did that day wasn't police work. It was harassment, pure and simple, and when I tried to question it, even gently, he dismissed me." Raymond's attorney tried to suggest that Lisa was only testifying to save her own career, but Lisa didn't flinch. "I'm testifying because it's the right thing to do. Because I took an oath to uphold the law, not to protect officers who break it." The defense called a few character witnesses, officers who'd worked with Raymond and who insisted he wasn't racist, that he'd always been professional with them. But under cross-examination, the prosecution pointed out that all these witnesses were white officers. None of them could speak to how Raymond treated people of color, because they'd never been on the receiving end of his stops. During the trial, more victims came forward. People who hadn't filed complaints at the time because they didn't think anyone would believe them. The prosecution couldn't add these to the charges, but they painted a picture of years of misconduct that had gone unchallenged. Outside the courthouse, the protesters continued their vigil. They held signs demanding justice, demanding reform, demanding that the police department be held accountable. Vincent walked past them each day of the trial, and several recognized him. They thanked him for his courage, for finally taking action. But Vincent didn't feel particularly courageous. He felt exhausted and frustrated that it had taken this long, that so many people had been hurt before anyone with authority had been willing to act. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts, Raymond sat stone-faced as the judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, several victims gave impact statements. Tyler Brooks spoke about how the assault and the dismissal of his complaint had affected his trust in institutions, how it had shaped his decision to become a civil rights attorney. Rachel Kim described the fear she'd felt, how she'd been afraid to drive for months after her encounter with Officer Phillips. The judge listened carefully to all of them. When it was time to pronounce sentence, she looked directly at Raymond. "Detective Cole, you were given a position of trust and authority. You swore an oath to protect and serve all members of this community. Instead, you used your badge as a weapon against people based on the color of their skin. You violated their rights and then you lied about it. The law requires accountability, and today, you will be held accountable." She sentenced him to 2 years in federal prison, along with a permanent ban from working in law enforcement anywhere in the country. Raymond was led away in handcuffs, and for the first time since this all began, he allowed himself to cry. Officer Brandon Phillips's trial followed a similar pattern, and he received an 18-month sentence. The message was clear. The department would no longer protect officers who violated people's rights. But Vincent knew that convictions alone weren't enough. Real change required reforming the entire system. Working with Chief Mendez and the Civilian Oversight Board, he drafted a comprehensive reform package. Body cameras became mandatory and tamper-proof, with footage automatically uploaded to secure servers that Internal Affairs could access without going through the chain of command. Officers who turned off their cameras during interactions with the public would face immediate suspension. The complaint process was completely overhauled. Complainants could now file online, by phone or in person at community centers, not just at police stations where they might feel intimidated. Every complaint would be investigated by Internal Affairs, not by the officer's direct supervisor. And there would be regular public reports on complaints and their dispositions. Perhaps most importantly, they established real consequences for officers who engaged in discriminatory policing. Pattern analysis would be conducted quarterly, and any officer showing statistical disparities in their stops would be flagged for review and retraining. 3 strikes and you were out, no exceptions. The old guard resisted. A dozen senior officers, including 2 captains, chose to take early retirement rather than work under the new system. Vincent saw this as a feature, not a bug. These were exactly the officers who'd been enabling the old culture. Officer Lisa Chen was promoted to sergeant for her integrity during the investigation. She became an advocate for reform within the ranks, helping to bridge the gap between the reformers and the rank-and-file officers who were skeptical, but open to change. "This isn't about attacking cops," Lisa told her fellow officers during roll call one morning. "This is about making sure we can do our jobs without being associated with people like Raymond Cole. Don't you want to be trusted by the community? Don't you want people to see your badge and feel safer, not scared?" Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Younger officers who'd been afraid to speak up started reporting concerns about their colleagues. The code of silence was beginning to crack. Vincent received a letter one day from an unexpected source. It was from Raymond Cole, now 3 months into his prison sentence. The letter was short and to the point. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what he'd done. He simply said that he'd had a lot of time to think, and he finally understood the harm he'd caused. He knew an apology meant nothing at this point, but he wanted Vincent to know that he was sorry. Vincent read the letter twice, then filed it away. He wanted to believe Raymond had genuinely changed, but he also knew that remorse often comes only after consequences. If Raymond had never been caught, would he have ever stopped? Vincent doubted it. The reforms were working, slowly but surely. Complaints about discriminatory policing had dropped by 40% in 6 months. Community trust surveys showed improvement, particularly in neighborhoods that had previously been over-policed. Officers were being more thoughtful about their stops, more respectful in their interactions. It wasn't perfect. Change never happened overnight, especially in an institution as resistant to change as law enforcement. But it was progress, real and measurable progress. And for Vincent, sitting in his office late one evening reviewing the latest statistics, that was enough to keep going. 6 months after the verdicts, Commander Vincent Hayes stood in front of a room full of new police recruits. This was part of the reformed training program, where internal affairs commanders spoke directly to incoming officers about accountability and integrity. Vincent looked at the young faces staring back at him, some nervous, some eager, all probably wondering what they'd gotten themselves into. "I want to tell you about a traffic stop," Vincent began. He clicked a button, and body camera footage appeared on the screen behind him. It was the stop, his stop. The recruits watched in uncomfortable silence as Detective Raymond Cole lied about the broken taillight, made up probable cause, and treated Vincent with barely disguised contempt. When the video ended, Vincent let the silence hang for a moment. That officer is now in federal prison. His supervisor lost his job, and the department spent millions in settlements to people they'd mistreated, all because of choices that began with small compromises and ended with civil rights violations. One recruit, a young woman in the front row, raised her hand. "Commander, how do we make sure we don't end up like him?" "By remembering that the badge doesn't make you better than anyone else," Vincent replied. "It gives you authority, yes, but authority without accountability is just tyranny. Every person you encounter on this job is someone's son or daughter, someone's parent or sibling. Treat them accordingly." The reforms Vincent had implemented were showing results beyond just reduced complaints. The department had launched a community liaison program, where officers spent time in neighborhoods not responding to calls, but building relationships. They visited schools, attended community meetings, and listened to concerns. Officer Lisa Chen, now Sergeant Chen, ran one of these programs in the neighborhood where that teenage kid had been stopped on his bicycle. She'd actually tracked the kid down and apologized on behalf of the department. His name was Marcus, and he was now 17 and preparing for college. Lisa had helped him apply for a police-sponsored scholarship for students interested in criminal justice. "I want to change the system from inside," Marcus told her during one of their meetings. "What happened to me was wrong, but what Commander Hayes did, what you're doing now, that gives me hope that things can be different."